At 0347 hours, radar stations across the East China Sea detect thermal signatures consistent with ballistic missile launches. Within 90 seconds, threat assessment algorithms flag the trajectories as non-standard. The missiles aren't following parabolic arcs, they're maneuvering. By the time human operators confirm what the systems are telling them, the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicles have already separated from their boosters and begun their terminal approach at Mach 10. The USS Ronald Reagan, operating 200 nautical miles east of Taiwan, has approximately 8 minutes before impact. Its Aegis combat system cycles through intercept solutions, but the geometry keeps shifting. The target won't stop moving. And in those 8 minutes, every assumption about naval supremacy, crisis management, and the future of Pacific deterrence is being tested at 7,600 miles per hour. This isn't speculation. The weapon exists. China has conducted multiple successful tests of the DF-17 since 2019 and declared initial operational capability in 2020. The system was prominently displayed during the 2019 National Day Parade in Beijing, a deliberate signal that this wasn't experimental technology, but an operational asset integrated into the People's Liberation Army rocket force. What makes the DF-17 strategically significant isn't just its speed or its range, estimated at 1,800 to 2,500 kilometers, depending on flight profile, but its function as an anti-access weapon, designed specifically to target the backbone of American military power in the Pacific, carrier strike groups. The technical profile reveals the problem. Traditional ballistic missiles follow predictable trajectories, determined by physics and initial launch parameters. Once the boost phase ends, the missile is essentially a projectile, governed by gravity and momentum. Defensive systems exploit this predictability. They calculate where the missile will be at any given moment and position interceptors along that path. The mathematics are complex, but solvable. Hypersonic glide vehicles break that model entirely. After separating from the booster at the edge of space, the DF-17's glide vehicle re-enters the atmosphere, but maintains enough velocity and lift to maneuver. It can execute lateral shifts of hundreds of miles while sustaining hypersonic speed, which means the intercept point isn't fixed. It's constantly recalculating based on decisions made by the vehicle's guidance system.
American missile defense architecture wasn't designed for this threat profile. The Aegis ballistic missile defense system, deployed across Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke destroyers, was optimized to intercept ballistic missiles during their mid-course or terminal phase. The SM-3 interceptor targets threats in the exo-atmospheric mid-course phase, while the SM-6 engages during terminal descent. Both systems assume relatively predictable target behavior. The SM-6, despite recent upgrades to enhance its capability against maneuvering threats, operates within physical and computational constraints. The interceptor must be launched early enough to reach the intercept point, but against a target that can change course after your missile is already in flight, early launch creates opportunities for evasion. Late launch reduces your intercept window to the point where success becomes probabilistic rather than assured. The operational mathematics become stark when you model a saturation attack scenario. A carrier strike group typically includes 1 or 2 Aegis cruisers and several Aegis destroyers, each equipped with approximately 90 vertical launch cells carrying a mix of offensive and defensive missiles. Against a high-value threat like an incoming hypersonic weapon, standard doctrine might allocate 6 to 8 interceptors per target to achieve a high probability of kill. And if China launches a coordinated strike with 4 DF-17s simultaneously, well within operational capability given the system is mobile and can be deployed across multiple launch sites, the defensive response requires 24 to 32 interceptors. That's approximately 1/3 of the strike group's total missile inventory expended in a single engagement. And if the intercept geometry isn't optimal, if the targets are maneuvering effectively, if electronic warfare degrades radar tracking, those probability calculations shift unfavorably. This is where scenario analysis transitions from technical to strategic. In a Taiwan contingency, the fundamental question facing American military planners isn't whether they can defend against a DF-17 strike. The question is whether they can maintain carrier operations within the weapons engagement envelope while accepting the risk that defensive measures might fail. And if the answer is no, then the entire force structure predicated on carrier-based power projection requires reconsideration. Carriers exist to project air power into contested regions, but if those carriers must operate 600 to 800 miles from Taiwan to remain outside hypersonic range, their ability to influence events in the strait diminishes proportionally. FA-18E/F Super Hornets have a combat radius of approximately 450 nautical miles, with aerial refueling that extends to roughly 700 miles, but sustained operations at maximum range degrade sortie generation rates, limit loiter time over targets, and increase vulnerability to Chinese air defenses as aircraft spend more time in hostile airspace.
The strategic calculus inverts. Instead of carriers enabling intervention, carriers become constraints that limit operational flexibility. And Chinese military planners understand this inversion. The DF-17 doesn't need to sink American carriers to achieve strategic effect. It only needs to establish a credible threat sufficient to force those carriers beyond effective operational range. In deterrence theory, this is called anti-access area denial, creating conditions where an adversary cannot safely operate in a given region without accepting unacceptable losses. The DF-17 is the kinetic manifestation of A2AD doctrine, a weapon designed not to win battles, but to make American intervention in a Taiwan conflict operationally untenable. But deterrence operates on perception as much as capability. If Beijing believes Washington won't risk carrier strike groups against hypersonic threats, then the credibility of American security commitments erodes. This creates a crisis stability problem. Taiwan's defense planning assumes American intervention in the event of Chinese aggression. That assumption shapes everything from military procurement to diplomatic posturing to domestic political calculations about resistance versus accommodation. If the DF-17 undermines confidence in American intervention, it shifts the strategic balance without firing a shot. And if Taiwan's leadership calculates that American carriers won't enter the fight, the incentive to resist a Chinese ultimatum diminishes. Why suffer invasion and occupation if the promised protection won't materialize? This is the psychological dimension that kinetic analysis often misses. Weapons don't just destroy targets, they shape decision-making by altering the perceived costs and risks of various courses of action. The DF-17 imposes costs on American intervention that didn't exist 5 years ago. Those costs aren't hypothetical. They're expressed in destroyed multi-billion-dollar assets, dead sailors, and the potential loss of naval supremacy in the Pacific. And rational actors avoid high-cost scenarios when lower-cost alternatives exist. The alternative to intervention is accommodation, accepting Chinese action in Taiwan as a fait accompli, and adjusting regional security architecture accordingly. That accommodation has second-order effects across the Indo-Pacific. If America won't defend Taiwan, why would Japan trust security guarantees? Why would South Korea assume American commitment is reliable? Why would the Philippines maintain military cooperation with a partner that demonstrated strategic unreliability when tested?
The cascading credibility crisis extends beyond Asia. NATO allies in Europe observe Pacific dynamics closely. If the United States demonstrates that advanced weapon systems can deter intervention in one theater, adversaries in other theaters will pursue similar capabilities.
Russia is already developing hypersonic systems, including the Avangard glide vehicle and the Kinjal air-launched missile. If the DF-17 proves operationally effective in constraining American power, expect proliferation. Iran, North Korea, and other regional actors will accelerate their own hypersonic programs, calculating that what works for China in the Pacific might work for them in their respective regions. The strategic utility of the weapon guarantees its spread, and each proliferation event degrades the effectiveness of existing missile defense architectures further. The American response is unfolding across multiple vectors, but none offer near-term solutions. The Glide Phase Interceptor program, being developed by Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, aims to create a missile specifically designed to engage hypersonic threats during their glide phase, the portion of flight where they're maneuvering but not yet in terminal descent. The concept is sound. Intercept the weapon while it's still hundreds of miles from the target before it can execute terminal maneuvers. But the program isn't expected to reach initial operational capability until 2032 at the earliest, and that timeline assumes no major technical setbacks. In the interim, the vulnerability window remains open. Directed energy weapons represent another potential solution. High-energy lasers, if sufficiently powerful and accurately targeted, could engage hypersonic vehicles at the speed of light, eliminating the intercept geometry problem entirely. The Office of Naval Research and the Missile Defense Agency are funding multiple laser development programs, but the technical challenges are substantial. A laser powerful enough to damage a hypersonic vehicle through atmospheric interference requires megawatts of power generation, sophisticated tracking systems capable of maintaining target lock on a maneuvering object traveling at Mach 10, and thermal management systems to prevent the weapon from destroying itself during sustained firing. Current shipboard laser demonstrations operate at power levels far below what's required for hypersonic defense. Scaling from experimental prototypes to operational systems will take decades or more, assuming the physics cooperate.
This leaves left of launch options, destroying or disrupting hypersonic weapons before they're fired. This category includes kinetic strikes against mobile launch platforms, cyber operations targeting command and control networks, and electronic warfare designed to interfere with guidance systems. Each approach carries escalation risks. Striking launch sites on Chinese territory constitutes an act of war against the mainland, crossing a threshold that dramatically expands conflict scope. Cyber operations against military networks might be interpreted as precursors to broader attacks on critical infrastructure, triggering Chinese retaliation against American cyber targets. And because left-of-launch strategies require preemptive action, you can't wait for missiles to launch before attacking the launchers. They pressure decision-makers toward escalation during crises, when tensions are highest and miscalculation risks are most acute. The escalation ladder becomes dangerously compressed. In previous conflicts, military planners operated with the assumption that escalation would be gradual, allowing opportunities for negotiation and de-escalation at each step. But when weapons travel at hypersonic speeds and defensive windows are measured in minutes, gradual escalation becomes impossible. The gap between peace and full-scale war narrows to the point where crisis management tools stop functioning. There's no time for diplomatic signaling, no opportunity to test adversary resolve through limited action, no space for miscommunication to be corrected before kinetic effects become irreversible. And this compression occurs in an environment where nuclear weapons remain operational. China maintains a nuclear arsenal estimated at 500 warheads, with projections suggesting expansion to 1,500 by 2035. The DF-17, while primarily a conventional system, shares launch infrastructure and command networks with China's nuclear forces. During a conflict, when American satellites detect launches from known missile sites, immediate threat assessment must determine whether incoming weapons are conventional or nuclear. The speed of hypersonic weapons collapses decision timelines to the point where that assessment must be made within minutes. If you assume conventional and you're wrong, you've failed to execute nuclear response protocols during the brief window when they might be effective. If you assume nuclear and you're wrong, you've escalated a conventional conflict toward nuclear exchange based on a misidentification.
This ambiguity is strategically exploitable. If China can use the threat of nuclear miscalculation to deter American strikes against DF-17 launch sites, the weapon becomes effectively invulnerable to left-of-launch attacks. And if American carriers can't operate within DF-17 range and left-of-launch strikes are deterred by nuclear ambiguity, then the weapon achieves its strategic purpose without being fired. The mere existence of the capability constrains American operational freedom, which in turn undermines deterrence commitments, which destabilizes regional security, which creates incentives for Chinese action during the window of American vulnerability. Military theorists call this a strategic inflection point, a moment when the balance of capabilities shifts enough to invalidate existing doctrines and force fundamental restructuring. The United States Navy has operated under the assumption of carrier invulnerability since World War II. Yes, carriers face threats from submarines, aircraft, and cruise missiles, but layered defenses and operational doctrine mitigated those risks to acceptable levels. The DF-17 represents a threat category that current doctrine cannot adequately mitigate. You can't simply add more interceptors or improve radar tracking. The problem is fundamental. Hypersonic maneuverability defeats the mathematical assumptions that missile defense relies on. The long-term response will likely involve distributed operations, dispersing American power across smaller, more numerous platforms operating from multiple locations rather than concentrating it in carrier strike groups. The Marine Corps is already restructuring toward this model, developing expeditionary advanced base operations that emphasize mobility and long-range fires rather than traditional amphibious assault. The Navy is pursuing unmanned surface vessels and smaller combatants that present less lucrative targets than carriers. The Air Force is investing in long-range strike capabilities that can operate from bases outside hypersonic range. But this restructuring requires decades and hundreds of billions of dollars, and even after completion, the resulting force structure will be less capable of certain missions than the carrier-centric model it replaces. Which means there's a gap, a period of years, possibly a decade or more, where the DF-17 and similar systems pose threats that American defenses cannot reliably counter, but alternative force structures haven't fully matured. In that gap, deterrence depends on perception management and strategic ambiguity. The United States must convince potential adversaries that despite vulnerabilities, intervention remains credible. That requires demonstrating willingness to accept risks, which in practice means operating carriers within hypersonic engagement envelopes during peacetime to signal resolve. But peacetime signaling creates crisis instability. The more frequently carriers operate in high-risk zones, the more opportunities exist for accidents, miscalculations, or deliberate provocations that spiral into conflict. And once conflict begins, the calculus becomes binary. Either carriers remain in theater and accept attrition, or they withdraw and concede operational space. There's no middle option where carriers are partially committed or selectively employed. The weapon's speed and range make half measures impossible. And that binary choice, risk carriers or abandon intervention, is itself a strategic defeat, because it means Chinese capability has successfully constrained American options to the point where no good choices remain, only varying degrees of bad ones. This is what the DF-17 actually represents, not just a technological achievement or a new weapons system, but the weaponization of time itself. By compressing decision cycles to minutes and eliminating the space for gradual escalation, it transforms crisis management from a deliberate process into an automated response governed by pre-programmed protocols. And when protocols replace judgment, when speed eliminates deliberation, when the gap between detection and impact is too narrow for human cognition to meaningfully intervene, you haven't just changed warfare, you've removed the last buffer between political decisions and kinetic catastrophe. The missile that could end a war in 10 minutes doesn't end the war. It ends the possibility that the war could be stopped once it starts.